Alright, me darlings? Well, we're now officially in the most depressing time of the year. The sun's pissed off on its holidays, it's raining all the time, the lovely brown leaves of autumn have turned into a disgusting slushy salad, and the only holiday that we in the UK have at this time of year is a flimsy excuse to burn things. Not that I need an excuse to do that anyway, but regardless, things aren't exactly the best until we get into the more festive time of year next month. So, let's cheer these times up by talking about my favourite animated movie, Rock&Rule. Yes, those who watched my Doctor Who cartoon video will remember me mentioning this one. Well, now it's time to take a closer look. Rock&Rule was the first major release from Canadian animation studio Nelvana. They had done a few shorts and TV specials at this point, such as Intergalactic Thanksgiving and The Devil and Daniel Mouse, which I'll be getting back to soon, but this was their first major motion picture, and the project that had really helped put them on the map. Speaking in context of the industry, of course, since a lot of people still don't seem to know who they are, you remember Fairly Odd Parents enough to be able to make 3 live-action movies based off of it, but you can't be asked to remember who made them? The movie was released in 1984, 1 year after the release of Tron. And boy does that show. This movie is so engrossed with the tech-noir style of the early 80s that I'm surprised we don't see Jeff Bridges and David Warner prowling around it. The movie was essentially an attempt to be a post-apocalyptic rock opera animation starring anthropomorphic animals. Which is certainly an original idea. I can't say I can think of any other movies that have that kind of premise. So let's take a closer look at the one and only Rock&Rule. The movie starts off with a bit of establishing text that explains that during the Cold War, the USA and Russia eventually did nuke each other and pretty much destroyed all of human life. And given what's been going on between the US and North Korea lately, this movie actually might be closer to becoming a reality than we all might think. All humans were destroyed in the conflict, but animals that live on the street, such as dogs, cats and rats, have mutated into human-like creatures that have made a new society out of the remains of the old ones, and have a particular fascination with music and dancing. So basically it's Fallout, Zootopia and Footloose all thrown together into a blender. With a little bit of Satan in there too, but we'll get into that in a minute. With the general backstory covered, the movie then gets into detail about how the biggest rock and roll superstar, Muck the Magic Man, has started to fall from grace after his concert gets less than attendance than he was expecting, and according to the official handbook that comes with the DVD, that meant that there was only 1 seat that was unattended, and he decides that the world and all the animals in it are foul, poisoned and cruel, and decides to destroy them all. Muck the Magic Man, the post-apocalyptic equivalent of Kanye West. He plans to fulfill his gambit by summoning a demon from another dimension in order to destroy all those who defied him and get revenge on his disgraceful and betraying fans. How can he do this? How did he discover this other dimension? Never explained. Though, in fairness, there is kind of a reason why. It's not necessarily a good reason, but I will get into that later. He's built the machine to summon him, but the last component is missing, the voice of an angel. Or, in less than layman's terms, a voice that can harmonise with the special dimensional frequency and open up the doorway to the other dimension. Imagine if that's how we had to open the Stargate, by singing to it. That's pretty much the only thing that would have made the Roland Emmerich Stargate movie even more ridiculous. Mock's search everywhere, but he can't find this perfect voice. But he has one last stop on his world tour to find it, which he's disguised to the public by saying that he's looking for new talent for his next album. And this last stop just so happens to be the venue that our main characters are performing at.
What an incredible coincidence.
We are then introduced to said characters. Omar, the brash, self-centered, but secretly sensitive frontman, voiced by Paul Amat, or Greg Sultana in the Canadian version. He's desperate to get his band recognised and become the next big thing, and often doesn't care about others in his quest to do so, even though he's doing this for his bandmates as much as he is for himself.
I don't know, Angel. I guess I just want it all.
So essentially Omar is the musical equivalent of Doctor Doom. Angel? Yes, seriously, there's actually a character called Angel in this movie. I do wonder what's going to happen to her. The somewhat pouty but bubbly keyboard player and backup singer, who has dreams of being the main singer, voiced by Susan Roman, and has become the fan art favourite of this movie, since anytime you type Rock&Rule into DeviantArt, you'll probably find pictures of her. Even in obscure animated films, fan artists can't seem to keep away.
I want everything too, Omar.
And then there's the other two. Dizzy, the stout, down-to-earth and intellectual drummer of the team, and according to the booklet, the creator of the group's instruments, voiced by Dan Hennessy. He's the one who, while doesn't stand out as much, is the nice guy to have around, and often is the parent to the group, getting the gang out of trouble and giving advice.
You'll be okay, you're just nervous. Take a deep breath. Hey, wait! I'm not nervous! I'm scared!
And finally, there's Stretch, voiced by Greg Duffel, the wacko-jacko axe-slinging nutcase of the group, who loves video games and is constantly shouting and screaming.
Oh no! This is my car! My wheels! My voltage wagon!
And yes, while that kind of can get a bit annoying, he is rather endearing in his own special little way, and unlike most annoying comic relief, they know when to shut him up from time to time. I'm looking at you, minions from Despicable Me. Together they are the Omars. Jeez, ego much, big guy? And when they play their big songs to the crowd, Mock's weird voice detector ring senses that Angel is the one with the perfect voice that he needs. And essentially from that point on, the movie is about Mock trying to get Angel to sing at his next concert while the rest of the gang desperately tries to get her back. Now if only Genesis cared so much about getting an old band member back. Though I don't think Phil Collins would resort to doing deals with the devil to make his music better. Well, then again, he did agree to do a Disney movie. Twice. If it's not been made clear throughout the review so far, as much as I love this movie, it certainly isn't perfect. The plot is ridiculous, and often the pacing is very all over the place, with plot elements taking forever to happen, even when we know that they're going to happen, and others coming right the hell out of nowhere. But despite the flaws this movie has, there are many things that makes it charming, cool, and above all, really unique. And that all starts with what you would expect the highlight from this movie to be: the soundtrack. With a movie called Rock&Rule, you'd expect there to be some great tunes to go along with it, and boy does this movie deliver. First off, Omar's singing voice is provided by Robin Zander, the lead singer of Cheap Trick, and the first song we hear in the movie is the band's song Born to Raise Hell. Angel's voice is provided by Debbie Harry, aka Blondie, and her song Send Love Through comes right on after that. I'm not quite sure which one I prefer better of the Blondie songs I've heard this year, that or her new songs from her new album. That seems like a plug, doesn't it? But trust me, it isn't. This is really a good album. Buy it now. And Mock's singing voice is provided by both 70s punk stars Lou Reed and Iggy Pop.
My name is Mark, thanks a lot. I know you love the pain you got. You've never seen the likes of me. Why, I'm the biggest thing since World War III, girl.
And not only did they all provide new original songs for this movie, but we also get an original song by the kings of disco themselves, Earth, Wind and Fire, and one of the best songs from them in my opinion.
I'm so glad to see you, and I'm hoping that you feel the same.
And Melody Brown is in it for some reason as well. Regardless, this is one of the best soundtracks to any movie in my opinion, and while the songs do kind of come out of nowhere sometimes and are a bit tonally indifferent from the scenes that they appear in, they are always welcome to see, and they are all amazing. If I had to pick a favourite, it would probably be Earth, Wind and Fire's Dance 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 in the disco scene, or Debbie Harry's Send Love Through. But then again, as short as it is, I do really love the Invocation song. Never has summoning Satan sounded so good. Also, this may be the only movie in the world to be able to claim that its final song contains a duet with both Debbie Harry and Robin Zander, two artists that you'd think would never ever do a duet together, but they do, and it is awesome. Seriously, what other movie can claim that? Sadly, due to the movie's limited release, an official soundtrack was never made or released for purchase, but some of the songs can still be found online or on compilations album of the bands and artists who were in the movie. Seriously, having to track down each and every one of these individual songs to put together onto a compilation to make my own self-made soundtrack for the movie took so long, but was so satisfying. It's like being a musical archaeologist. And probably paid a little bit better than being an actual archaeologist. The other thing I really like about the movie are its characters. I mean, sure, most of them are rather underdeveloped in stock, but the animation and the voice acting does a great job of making them seem alive, and they are really enjoyable to be around. Omar's tough guy attitude, Angel's innocence and fun-loving character, but imposing attitude, Dizzy's simple charm, and even some of the minor characters like sleazy club owner Mylar and Officer Quadhole. But by far, the best character in the whole movie is the villain, Mock.
Open your eyes! Accept my offer.
No, Mock. I couldn't leave them for anything.
I didn't offer you anything. I offer you everything!
As I mentioned earlier, Mock's motivation and plan is kinda ridiculous in the grand scheme of things, and in fairness, it's kind of supposed to be, but you also get the idea that the movie is trying to make you take him seriously, which you just can't do that when his plan is so over the top and insane. But his personality, his animation, and especially his voice acting by the late great Don Franks really makes this character stand out.
Yes, my beast, their nightmare, all mine, for a song. And then, nothing can stop me.
His voice is simply amazing. It's like Christopher Lee fucked Liam Neeson's voice. Every word he says you totally believe, no matter how silly. It's one of the most incredible vocal performances ever, in my opinion. Also, fun fact about Mock, some of you may be wondering why his face looks like a bad origami job. Well, as it turns out, Mock isn't his full name. In the original drafts of the script, Mock was to be called Mock Swagger, as a parody of Mick Jagger, hence why he looks like that. But at the last minute, Nelvana was scared that Mick would sue them and changed his name to The Magic Man. Though that explanation at least explains his weird accent change and the question when we first see him physically.
Anyone want a beer?
Mock isn't a particularly complex villain. In fact, he's downright ridiculous, to be honest. But through just some minor simple charms, he's become one of my all-time favourite movie characters and has provided me with one of my all-time favourite quotes in movie history.
But is what we are doing evil?
Of course not. Remember, Zip, evil spelled backwards is live. And we all want to do that.
Even the more minor characters are memorable from their voice acting. As I mentioned before, we've got Mylar, the sleazy club owner that the Omars perform at during their first scene.
Welcome to Mylar's, the launching pad of the stars. Easy on the polyesters, guys.
Officer Quadhole, the stereotypical hard-ass police officer.
I'll get the evidence.
Nah, I'll get the evidence. No, you get the evidence.
I'll get it.
Nah.
I'll get it.
Dizzy's Aunt Edith, a tattooist who lives in the big city of New York, and is voiced by voice acting and comedy legend Catherine O'Hara, who voiced Sally in The Nightmare Before Christmas, and most significantly played Kevin's mum in Home Alone 1 and 2.
Relax, Oscar. I was just beginning to like you, you little scumbag.
Mock's roller skating bodyguards Toad, Sleazy and Zip.
Mes assistants stupides.
I just love it when he talks French.
Who provide a decent amount of comic relief, and while they don't get a lot of screen time, are nice additions in a Three Stooges-esque fashion, with Toad being the no-nonsense tough guy.
What have you done with her?
We didn't do nothing. She's gonna New York with Mock.
Sleazy being, well, sleazy, and Zip being the wide-eyed innocent one of the three, who gets the most amount of development in the movie, and his relationship with Mark gives us one of the best quotes in the movie.
Hey, boss, can you tell the difference between good and evil?
Their sister Cinderella is also an interesting character, the only animated woman I've ever seen who's built like a brick shithouse, and helps out Angel when she's captured by Mock. And even this sailor guy gets some good lines, though that's probably because he's voiced by the brain himself, Maurice LaMarche.
Now there's 3 guys from hometown gonna drop anchor there with a cargo of trouble. They're looking for your little sister. Oh, now we're even, right? Oh, shit. Now we're even.
If I weren't a large cheese, I would make you pay for that remark.
All of these characters, no matter how small, have their own very unique and slightly annoying, but very endearing charm to them. And while admittedly a lot of them have no bearing on the plot, in fairness, this is kind of a road trip movie in a way, so these are all the colourful characters you meet on that trip, and I'm perfectly fine with that. And of course, with a movie from the guys who would later bring us Care Bears, Fairly Odd Parents, and the Star Wars cartoons, naturally the movie is gorgeous in its own grimy post-apocalyptic way. The whole thing does look like a world that is built from the broken remains of an old one, and apparently in the Ohm Town, the setting of which the first few scenes of the movie take place, the sun doesn't seem to exist anymore because it's all in these dark, almost gothic street environments. But it has the feel of a back alley in a town that, while not necessarily safe, you enjoy the thrill of being in, and given the distance from a place which they call Nuke York, you can probably guess where that used to be, which is where the rest of the movie takes place in, and given Omar's accent, it's possible that Ohmtown is where Boston used to be, which would make perfect sense in that regard. Speaking of Nuke York, the city looks very much like a city from Fallout, which I alluded to earlier, but with a little bit of Blade Runner in there. But if Blade Runner had a sun on it, and it looks awesome. One of the most shamelessly 80s looking animated films I've ever seen, and it totally engrosses itself in it, which is awesome. I suppose really when it comes down to it, the reason I love this movie so much is because I don't see it for necessarily what it is, but for what it could have been. It was an incredibly ambitious project back in the day. A feature-length animated movie done by an independent studio made with a small budget and starring high-profile rock stars. It's no wonder the movie came out a bit of a mess. I'm surprised it made it out at all with all of that going on, but it's hard to deny that with a little bit more story refinement, better characterization and development, taking out some of the sillier aspects and fixing some of the pacing a little bit, this could have been one of the greatest animated films of all time. And as is, it's just a little forgotten movie from the early 80s, but it definitely has some great things in it, and some that you can't find in any animated movie, even today. Though it can be argued that some of the sillier elements do happen for a reason. It's not quite a good reason, but there is a reason. Rock&Rule was actually a remake of Nelvana's first ever animated special, The Devil and Daniel Mouse, which in itself was an adaptation of a classic Faust tale, where a man sells his soul to the devil to become a popular musician. That's why Angel is called Angel, and instead of just putting a bomb in the audience, Mock decides to summon a demon. Yeah, it's ridiculous, but at least there's a reason for it. Like I said, it's not necessarily a good reason for the silly aspects of the movie, but at least it makes it a bit more sense now. Regardless of all that, this is still one of my all-time favourite animated movies. Even if it is a mess and fails in a lot of areas, the good stuff is just so appealing to me that I can't help but love it. It's a bit hard to get a hold of these days since, due to the Ralph Bakshi trademark of having all the girls' nipples poked through their shirts and having a lot of drug references everywhere.
I got uppers and downers, inners and outers, screamers and shouters, and things that make you go sideways, man.
Which would explain why a lot of people mistakenly thought this was actually one of his films at the time. Which, to be honest, I'm glad it's not. As much as I love Ralph Bakshi, I don't want to see what he would have done in the climax if this was one of his. Speaking of which, while the climax does seem very rushed and ends rather abruptly, the sheer visual chaos and majesty when the demon is finally summoned, along with a fantastic song by Iggy Pop, makes it all worth it.
Upside down in a river of mud. A cat, black, green eyes, and blood. Everywhere.
But even with all that, this was clearly a movie that, despite its visual and musical style being completely of the times, its choices in story and character development were way ahead of its time. Nobody really knew what to do with a movie that clearly a lot of adults wouldn't really care for, but wasn't appropriate for kids either. Nowadays we've got all sorts of animated shows and movies like that, but back in those days, only Bakshi was brave enough to do movies like that, though admittedly a lot of his movies bombed as well, though at least he was sleazy enough to make it appeal to adults more.
Why don't you sit there for a couple hours while I figure it out?
Okay.
But the movie can be thankfully found on DVD, and while I in no way promote piracy, if you live in a region where you can't get the DVD, both the international and Canadian version can be found on YouTube. So while I definitely recommend getting the DVD more because of the extras that come with it, if you're just a little bit curious, you can find it right on this website.
But she still pissed me off.
Check it out and see if it rocks your chords. But now, I've had enough of this. I'm going on the other side to have a bath. Bye!